Well, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes till we get started. Hi everyone. We're just going to give it another 30 seconds to a minute or so, and then we'll get started. Okay. I know people are still trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started, especially as it's quite late for some of the panelists already. Maybe I think like 10 p.m. or even later for some of you. So welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kim, and I'm the Intelligence Director at Transformers Foundation. And Transformers Foundation aims to put forward the perspectives of the denim supply chain on sustainability. But this is an initiative that includes a lot of other people and entities, so I will introduce everyone shortly. But just as a matter of housekeeping, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A as we go along. If it's appropriate or if there's a way to answer it as we go along, we will. Otherwise, we'll leave them for Q&A at the end. And also, just for context and framing, the objective, or the intention, I should say, of today's session is to really provide a high-level overview of what this guide is, why it was created, how we hope you will use it, what some of our key takeaways were and trends that we identified. And so it's really providing a bird's eye view of the resource as a whole. It is not a deep dive into specific pieces of legislation. But we will be doing that as well in future webinar sessions, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So with that, Rubia, if you could go to the next slide. So this resource was, as I said, commissioned and led by a number of different entities. And before I introduce everyone, I really want to emphasize that this is a supplier-led initiative, and that I don't think there are a ton of examples of suppliers coming together to collectively tackle shared challenges. And so I think symbolically, this is a really important aspect of this project. And I hope that it will inspire more similar such projects. But specifically, this resource was commissioned and led by Crystal Group. And from Crystal Group, we have Kyle on the line. Diamond Fabrics, which is part of Sapphire Group and a founder of Transformers Foundation. Lensing, which is also a founders of Transformers Foundation. Pactics Group, Poetic Gem, which is part of PDS Group. And from Poetic Gem, we have Kavita on the line. And we'll be presenting today. Shahi Exports, and from Shahi, we have Gori on the line. Simple Approach, which is also part of PDS Group. And Sorcery, which was a little bit of a new addition this year, in the sense that when we ran this same project last year, we didn't really have anybody who could help us to incorporate the perspective of cotton farmers in our work. And so we were very pleased that they were willing to support the work. And from Sorcery, we have Ruchita on the line. And this initiative was also supported by Transformers Foundation and also GIZ Fabric Asia. The report was written by the Remedy Project. So the Remedy Project, in a nutshell, they are basically the lawyers who wrote the report. And the process for creating this report was very much an iterative one, in the sense that, the legal teams kind of would have a go at presenting the information about various pieces of legislation and what it would mean for suppliers. And then this group would kind of take that and say, okay, well, what would that mean for suppliers? And so there was very much a back and forth between the Remedy Project and the entities that were leading this piece of work. The Remedy Project works with governments, civil society, law enforcement, and the private sector to translate the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into practice. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that this session, the intention of this session is really to do kind of a high-level overview of what the resource is, why we did it, key takeaways. But we will be doing deep dives into specific pieces of legislation together with the Remedy Project to kind of look in more detail and more closely at, what a given piece of legislation might mean for suppliers. And at the end of this presentation, there'll be a QR code linking to the registration site for that. We'll do the first one in September, in the middle of September. And the last thing I'll say before we really get into things is that this presentation, the slides for this presentation, were put together by the group as a collective. And although an individual has to present a particular slide, the opinions and the information that's being presented on that slide really is collective and, isn't necessarily attributable only to the person who is presenting that slide. So let me just look at my housekeeping list. Have I covered everything? Oh, Jessie. I would like to also introduce Jessie. Jessie is the project manager who coordinated and facilitated all of this. And without her, this project would not have happened. So thank you. And with that, I am going to pass to Ruchita to talk about why we commissioned this report and what's new. I mentioned already that we had a first iteration of this just about a year ago. So with that, I pass to you.
Thanks, Kim. And it's great to be here today and exciting to see so many people from the sector taking interest in wanting to know more about the guide. And as the fiber and textile sector continues to transition from voluntary-driven sustainability schemes, largely driven by brands and multi-stakeholder initiatives, to regulatory driven sustainability and chain of custody schemes, it is important for the suppliers to understand the existing and emerging legislation and the profound impacts it will have on their businesses and the future of sustainability reporting and due diligence in the sector. As the brands now begin to respond to the legislation, we see a clear shift is underway that places greater responsibility on the suppliers to meet the requirements of the legislation. It is fast becoming a prerequisite for doing business, ensuring that all facilities, all employees, all products and transactions from fiber to finished goods throughout the supply chain are more transparent and traceable and deliver more meaningful, measurable, and equitable social and environmental impact. And among the suppliers that we have been engaging with, we have seen there is a lot of uncertainty and more questions than answers at this point on how to move forward. As a first of its kind report, the aim is to sort of provide the suppliers with a go-to guide, with a trusted resource to understand the legislation and take practical steps together to ensure compliance in their own business as well as in the businesses of their vendors and their clients. And hence, the leading organizations present here today have joined forces to develop this valuable resource, which explains how the suppliers now need to collaborate in ways that did not exist yet by sharing knowledge, resources, and investing together in the future of the sector. Next slide, please. And what's new, this most recent report is built on the 12 legislative initiatives found in the 2023 report and also adds 3 new initiatives that were not previously included. The EU Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles, ESSCT, which aims to define circularity in a more practical way when it comes to extended use and reuse, repair, and recyclability of the products. Now, this strategy seeks to create a greener and fairer global supply chain, but it affects both EU-based companies and their international suppliers. The key actions here include setting design standards, improving product information availability, reducing overproduction, and enforcing extended producer responsibility. Now, what does that mean for suppliers? This means stricter environmental compliance, innovation with eco-friendly material, greater transparency about material origins and production impacts too. They will also be required to adopt circular economy practices across their supply chain, focusing on product reuse and recycling. And the second one here is German Due Diligence and Supply Chain Act, which today may be the most rigorous legislation and might serve as a preview of what may be required across the EU and perhaps globally in the future. This act imposes strict human rights and environmental standards on organizations operating in Germany and their global supply chains too. To mitigate risks, suppliers should proactively assess their operations, develop robust compliance frameworks, establish procedures, and invest in training of their staff and engage in open dialogue with their clients. There is also a need to enhance transparency, conduct thorough risk assessments, and maintain detailed records. Also, grievance mechanisms need to be established, and the suppliers should be prepared for increased scrutiny because non-compliance can lead to significant fines and reputational damage as well. Now, remember, the Act's impact extends beyond Germany, affecting global supply chains. And finally, a new section that is close to our hearts at Sorcery, where our sector can take learnings from other sectors under EU Directive 2019-633 on protecting farmers and smaller suppliers from unfair trading practices in agricultural and food supply chains. This includes defining and banning harmful practices, empowering suppliers to negotiate fair deals, and increasing transparency in the industry. The directive also establishes a framework for enforcement and complaint mechanisms. While the enforcement is still in early stages, but this directive is a significant step towards a fairer and more balanced marketplace. The directive's principles are also relevant to the garment industry, highlighting the need for fair practices and responsible purchasing in fashion. And at Sourcery, it is our mission to transform trade for good. Together with our partners, we are turning ambition into action through our programs, which are Sourcery's pioneering trade methodology and sourcing solutions that enable transparent, fair, and efficient transactions right from grower to the consumer. With a transformative new approach to sourcing, we at Sourcery already believed that social and environmental impact is a natural byproduct of better business and trade. That's all from me. Back to you, Kim.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to pass the mic to Kavita. Thank you for going to the next slide, who is going to elaborate in a bit more detail on which legislation is included and why. And she's also going to share a bit about how we hope suppliers will use this document.
Hi, everybody. So just to expand on what Ruchita just said, the legislations that we have looked at as a collective, obviously we looked at all the legislations upcoming, and there were over 60. We mapped 60 different initiatives. And as a collective, we figured that there were about 35 which have potential implications for suppliers in our supply chain. Of these, 12 were already included in the 2023 version, the first version of this report. And the updates were made to that this year. And we included 3 other legislations. One of them is actually not a legislation. I'll expand on that just now. So as you can see, the different colorations there were the ones in white are the various legislations which had minor updates this time. So they are all updated, each one of them is. And the green ones are the ones which were updated. There were major updates in those, obviously following changes, updates in the legislations themselves. And then the new fact sheets that we included are the ones that Ruchita also spoke about. The first one is numbered. So you can see that there are numbers to these fact sheets. That's one of the easy reference formats that we have. So it's easy for you to identify, for the first one, for example, is the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and so on and so forth. So we have this time the EU Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles, which in itself is not a legislation, but it looks to the EU Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan, as well as the European Industrial Strategy. And it sort of is a strategy which rises from the EU Green Deal. So there are various strategies to deliver the EU Green Deal, and this is one of them. And this strategy looks at the entire life cycle of textile products. So it looks at the social impacts of textile production, etc., the environmental impacts of it. So it looks at how do we produce these, how do we consume these, are they durable, are they repairable, have hazardous materials been used, for example. And basically wants the supply chain or the sectors to take more responsibility for the impacts of the industry. So so that's really what it's trying to deliver. The German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act is, as Ruchita mentioned earlier, one of the most rigorous acts yet. Now that the CSDDD has been adopted, it's possible it will harmonize with that, but the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act does place responsibility in many cases, or I would say could have impacts on the direct and indirect supply chains, because suppliers could become legally liable under this particular act. So that's something which is which makes this a very important fact sheet that we've created, fact sheet number 13. It does look into human rights, into environmental obligations, and obviously expects no violations, and it needs corrective action plans. It so it's looking, it's been in force since January 2023. So that is one to look out for and to understand. The fact sheet number 14. This is actually from the agricultural sector, and it's really about the lessons that the fashion supply chains can learn. It's about how there are various legislations or expectations which can impact various other supply chains, including our textile or apparel supply chain, and what are the lessons that we could learn from that, and how these could impact us or empower us, whether it's a collective to ask for or demand or advocate for better buying practices, etc. So Ruchita did highlight some of those impacts as well. So this is basically why we chose these legislations. Next slide, please. So this is just tried to make this a visually easy document. So we have considered, of course, in it everything down to color combinations and things, to make it an easy to use resource. There is included a glossary of terms. So you can refer to these, whether it's a term like what is a regulation, if you're talking about directive, what does that mean? What is difference? Then there is a section which actually tells you how to use this document. And you will see that there are points there like your key changes in legislations, the ones like we have updated, for example, then the overview of the entire fact sheet. So you're talking about a fact sheet. So I've taken an example of the EU strategy for sustainable and circular textiles, for example, in this case. So you will have a list of topics that you will then be able to deep dive into in the fact sheet going forward, and a snapshot of various legislations and what the impacts are, medium impacts, high impacts in which areas. So you have a section where you can look at every fact sheet which is covered in the report and have a little snapshot of some key areas in that report. Next slide, please. So this is what the fact sheet somewhat looks like. And of course, I've put together some sections there just so they become familiar to everybody. So the first section will be the overview, which will tell you more about what that fact sheet is about. The next would be the context, where you can find you can read about the policy foundations. You can read about the challenges which have been addressed by that legislation, or by, within that fact sheet. You will get an easy to understand guide over there, because everything's been sort of summarized in an easy to understand format. And then the scope is really important, because it will tell the players, the actors in the supply chain, whether or not your company is impacted. Of course, these legislations are targeted at brands, but then there are various legislations which, as we mentioned before, could directly or indirectly impact suppliers. So it's a very useful section which will help you, identify the scope of this legislation or within this fact sheet. Then a key section is the obligations for companies, because that's what you want to know. What would be the regulatory impact on the brands that you're working with, and therefore indirectly, possibly directly, on you as a supply chain actor. The potential implications for suppliers, because the key reason for putting together this collective and this set of fact sheets is that we need to understand from the supplier's point of view, the manufacturers, the global south, and other manufacturers all over the world, as to what are the implications for them. What is it that they're already facing, and what we need to be ready for. And then the penalties. I mean, there are penalties which could be Certain legislations can talk about 5 to 10% of your global turnover, which could be a penalty, for example. So there are various, and of course, these would be directed at the brands. But then there would be implications for the supply chain, whether it's through instruments like your contracts, agreements, etc. So then is that particular legislation in that fact sheet that we're talking about, what is the form of enforcement? Is it applicable? Is it not? Is it a sort of, is it a directive or is it a regulation? So, what is the legal standing of that? Is it a strategy? Like we spoke about the fact sheet 0. And then, of course, the requirements, the reporting or disclosure requirements of the companies, for the companies which are in scope, directly in scope, which will, of course, indirectly impact suppliers as well. So there are a few other sections, like you have a section on links to useful resources for each fact sheet, which are relevant to that fact sheet. And those will be live links, of course, because this is a digital document, and those are very helpful as well to understand and dive deeper into various regulations. That's it from me.
Thank you, Kavita. So I'm going to hand over to Gauri now, who, is going to talk a little bit about what this group sort of identified as the highlights and trends and the recommendations that we would make to fellow suppliers, having been through this process of reviewing these fact sheets with the Remedy Project and having this back and forth on, okay, this is what the law says, what might that mean for a supplier? So Gauri is going to summarize the insights that kind of came out of that process.
Thanks, Kim, for saying that. Yeah, and then these trends and recommendations are also available in our executive summary, so you could always refer to that if it feels too overwhelming to absorb all this information in the next few minutes. So when we all read through the fact sheets, we obviously going through 15 pieces of legislations is a lot, and it can get overwhelming. So we tried to summarize what we think are the 4 main implications or trends for suppliers, and as a group of suppliers, what is our reflection on those implications? What are the recommendations we want to make? So over the next 2 slides, I will cover these implications and our reflections. First is a positive trend. It is an indication of potentially a shift in the industry towards a focus on responsible purchasing practices and shared responsibility, particularly in the CSDDD. So in the EU CSDDD, new requirements were introduced for companies to review their purchasing practices, particularly when they are contracting with small and medium enterprises. So in this way, we hope that CSDDD can potentially foster more balanced trading relationships where brands' purchasing practices are given a similar weight to other risk factors when doing due diligence or when conducting risk assessment. So we see a lot of times that suppliers are required to report on their practices on social, environmental parameters, but purchasing practices is not often reported on. So we hope that this mention in the CSDDD can spark a shift in the industry. So as a result, our reflection and recommendation for suppliers is that this may allow for a more open conversation on purchasing practices, may allow suppliers to advocate for more ethical commercial practices and even demand fairer contracts. We also feel that there is a power in the collective voice of suppliers to demand disclosure from brands on their purchasing practices, and also look at the fact sheet that we were talking about earlier, the one on unfair trading practices in the agri-food supply chain. Look at those types of legislations and see how that can be replicated for our industry. So that's why, like Kim mentioned, we added it this time, because we do feel like it is a great opportunity to learn on how purchasing practices could actually become part of the legislative landscape. The second trend that we observed is the possibility of multiple interpretations of these legislations by brands, but also by EU member states, which could mean a lot of duplication and extra work for suppliers. And the reason behind this is that when brands interpret these legislations, they may operationalize these legal requirements in different ways, which means, again, suppliers may have to comply with conflicting standards. And already, if there are, suppliers who've joined the webinar, already we have multiple conflicting standards, audit standards, but also we are seeing a flood of new traceability tools, pilots, but also grievance redressal tools, programs, all which are sort of a direct result of these legislations. So brands wanting to act fast and deploy new standards and tools, leading to additional work for suppliers. Similarly, in the case of EU member states, when there are directives, they may interpret the EU requirements differently. For example, when CSDDD gets adopted by different member states, it could be interpreted differently, and that could lead to multiple due diligence processes for suppliers. So given this workload that we see coming, our reflection and recommendations for suppliers are that this is a good time to start engaging with brands and retailers proactively and understanding from them what are their implementation methodologies as a result of these legislations. We would also recommend that suppliers consider aligning with OECD due diligence guidelines and the UN guiding principles. That may somewhat minimize risk and duplication because most legislations are underpinned by these principles. And we would also want to warn suppliers that they can expect a flood of requests around adoption of third-party grievance mechanisms, particularly because there are certain specific remedy requirements in these regulations. So this may be the case as brands may perceive suppliers' existing grievance mechanisms as inadequate. And lastly, we do hope for a bit more advocacy on part of the industry bodies representing both brands and suppliers to try to drive commonality in audit requirements as much as possible, given the mounting audit costs that suppliers have to deal with. Similarly, we hope that these industry bodies and suppliers continue to advocate for harmonization across EU member states. Just as an example, in March 2024, the European Council and European Parliament reached a political agreement that if CSDDD is adopted, which it was, then the German Supply Chain Act will be harmonized with CSDDD, which is a great signal that in the future, other EU member states could also do the same. Next slide. The third trend is similar to the previous trend, wherein because of the multiple interpretations, etc., we do anticipate an increase in reporting requirements and data requests from suppliers, particularly with the adoption of CSDDD, EU FLA, and ESPR. In the last few months or the last year, we've seen rapid changes in the legislative landscape. So that's why we fear an increasing number of requests for data, which I'm sure many suppliers would already be experiencing. So, for example, there's increasing requests for visibility into the upstream supply chain partners' practices or full supply chain traceability for brands. Secondly, we also anticipate that brands may also start to alter their raw material purchasing behavior and may start to get more involved in textile processing to improve their sustainability performance, say as a result of the ESPR. They may get more involved in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and collecting data, understanding processes at that level. So for this, our reflection and recommendation to suppliers is to map their supply chain to the best of their abilities, ensuring that they have proper due diligence, documents, policies, and systems alongside documentation for any orders. as per the UFLPA and EU FLA guidelines, just in order to be prepared for brand requests or potential detentions by custom authorities. Second, we recommend that suppliers allocate sufficient resources to understand the legislative landscape. We, of course, recognize that there is already a lot of burden on ESG teams, and there's not enough resources to allocate towards existing projects. But given that legislation has already arrived, there's a need to shift the internal compliance mindset towards due diligence, and ESG teams can play a really important role in engaging, educating various departments like legal, HR, sourcing, and other operational functions so that adapting to the legislative landscape is a shared responsibility. And lastly, we recommend that to comply with these increasing reporting and data requirements, that manufacturers try to develop a stronger data management capacity, including improving their measuring systems to capture life cycle assessment data like water, energy, chemical per product. And wherever possible, digitizing these systems would be important to avoid a massive manual administrative burden of data collection. The last trend is potential legal implications for suppliers. I think Kavita did allude to this, that there could be direct or indirect legal implications for suppliers. So, for example, in German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, UFLPA, EUFLA, there could be potential direct implications. And even when there aren't direct implications, like when suppliers are not legally liable, there could be situations where brands might seek to create or transfer their liability to suppliers through contractual documents. So here our recommendation would be for suppliers to seek competent legal advice in case of any legal implications. Again, here also we understand that there's limited resources, but wherever possible, this should be sought. I referred to the German Act earlier, but just as an example, in the German Supply Chain Act, NGOs and trade unions are allowed to sue on behalf of affected individuals, which means that there could be action taken against suppliers if there is perceived contribution to non-compliance. And second, just to reiterate that with UFLPA and EUFLA, it's important to be well versed with these acts, understand their due diligence requirements, and be ready to offer relevant documentation, policies, management system evidences to prevent being blacklisted by customs authorities. And also suppliers should be ready to push back on any fines or penalties which they feel are unfairly being offloaded by brands onto suppliers. So just to summarize, we have these 4 trends that we feel could impact suppliers directly. And to the best of our abilities, we try to map how we feel suppliers could make some changes in the way that they operate. And we, like I said, we've put it in our executive summary as well. So that's a very handy read that you can go through and absorb and also share internally with your teams.
Thank you, Gauri. And now I'm going to hand over to Kyle, who will speak to our calls to action for legislators.
Okay, thank you, Kim and everyone. And before the Q&A session, I would like to outline the call to action for legislators. We believe that legislation is required to create a level playing field and drive companies across the value chain to make changes. Suppliers look for a just transition, but based on shared responsibility. As legislations gain more momentum, we call for enforcement and further development of legislation in an informed manner. So first, to move away from a top-down approach, which the legislations are relied on currently, this induces significant hidden work for suppliers who, in most cases, already disproportionately bear the burden of sustainability or due diligence relative to their margins. And second, to involve production experts like suppliers in the legislative development to ensure adequate supplier voice are heard. We believe that involving suppliers enables better informed, more equitable, and more impactful outcomes, as well as buy-in from the very beginning. Lastly, is about our concern on problem shifting. We worry that the legislation covered in this guide will shift legal responsibility from brands to suppliers, instead of sparking effective and collective action and shared responsibility. So I think this concludes my short talk, and I will hand over back to you, Kim. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle. And thank you to everyone for sharing and presenting. We're going to open the Q&A in just a moment, so I encourage you to start putting your questions in the Q&A box. While you organize your thoughts and articulate your questions, I want to bring your attention to 3 different things that might be of interest to people here today. The first QR code that you see on the left of this slide is the QR code to download the report. Please download the report, download the fact sheets, download the executive summary, engage with the parts of it that are useful to you. So that's the first thing. The second is this is the second iteration of this resource because the legislative landscape continues to evolve. So we hope that there will be future iterations of this resource as well, and also covering additional pieces of legislation. As was mentioned earlier, we mapped, I think, over 60 pieces of legislation that are potentially relevant for the apparel sector, and even that is probably not comprehensive. So there's a lot out there, and this this guide or this resource is really only covering a slice of what really suppliers and beyond need to know. So if you'd like to support future fact sheets, please scan that QR code in the middle of the screen. And on the right-hand side of the screen, the third QR code is to register for our next webinar. And as I mentioned, our next webinar will be a deep dive into a specific piece of legislation. I think the first one is going to cover the strategy, so Fact Sheet 0, and will be done in partnership with the Remedy Project, looking at what exactly does this piece of legislation say and what might it mean for suppliers. So I encourage you to also register for that one. I believe it's sometime in the middle of September. So to kick off the Q&A, as we wait for questions to come in, or maybe we've done such a good job presenting what we've done that there are no questions. But to kick things off, I'm going to ask Gauri and then Ruchita to reflect a little bit on, what do you think or hope or wish that suppliers should do after engaging with this report? And why do you think it might be a useful resource for suppliers?
Thank you, Kim. I think I already mentioned it a little bit when I was speaking earlier, that I think the executive summary is a great resource to just understand the overall trends and the landscape. But also, I think section 7 or 8, I always get confused. The one that talks about implications for suppliers. I think just looking at that section of each fact sheet also is a really nice, quick way of getting an understanding of how different legislations will impact suppliers. So going through that and then, circulating the exec summary and the fact sheets among key department heads, whether it's compliance, risk management, legal, ESG, and facilitating some internal dialogue on, okay, now how does this affect us? What policies do we need to change? What systems we need to develop? So even just, it really helps creating internal awareness on what's going on. Apart from that, I think I do wish that this sparks some sort of collaboration among suppliers as well, because there's lots of things that we need to overcome or work on, and everyone's working on the same thing. So can we, talk more, learn more from each other? And the last thing I would say is, I think if these fact sheets can help suppliers understand the implications, then we're in a better position to have more informed conversations with our customers of where we think we need extra support, or where we would want brands to maybe rethink their strategies. So we can't have those conversations unless we understand what's coming with these legislations.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Gauri. I think Gauri also greatly touched upon the fact that the first step will be to review the internal processes, review the systems that are already in place. But other than that, looking into the supply chain part, I feel the first step is to identify and map your supply chain and your supply chain partners and their suppliers and subcontractors. And we can't measure what we can't see, right? So we need to know our supply chain thoroughly first, and then understand the existing processes that are in place internally in the organization, plus in the supply chain partners organizations, and how their trading practices are being followed, and where are the gaps, and where are the gaps, and where people need to fill those gaps by looking at the legislation requirements. This go-to guide is a great example of people coming together, and this also Gauri touched upon that this is a great start. This is a starting point for us to recognize what needs to be done for the future. So yeah, I think mapping and internal assessments are the first steps for any supplier or any organization to begin with.
Thank you. Kyle, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Kim. Actually, the very first thing that I have received with this guy is I shared it with our corporate logistics department as well as our corporate finance department, because I think this is a very informative resource that we have to look together with the cross departmental efforts, because we understand that the sole effort of our sustainability department is not enough to cater to those upcoming challenges. So that's why we are sharing it out, and then we are going to have a meeting to see how can we integrate the impact or the potential impacts or the findings or any measures that we have to in place to prepare for this kind of potential impacts to our company. So this is my what we have done so far.
Thank you, Kyle. I see there's questions coming in. I'm gonna get to those. I just want to add, I think, one final thought from my perspective on this, which is that, you know, as Transformers Foundation, we were involved in last year's report as well. And as a result of that, you know, and like I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Transformers has really strong ties to denim suppliers and the denim supply chain. And what I kind of observed was that we were getting a lot of requests from denim suppliers who maybe had an interest in participating in the development of these legislations or the guidelines that go with them, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we had a lot of people working in the policy space coming to us and saying we would also like to connect with suppliers. So I think there's an appetite on both sides to sort of create this connection. However, I think there's also, it speaks to an infrastructural gap. Because, you know, as Transformers Foundation, what I could do in those situations was I could connect individuals. I could say, hey, you should talk to this supplier, or you should talk to that policymaker, or that person who's engaged in the policy space. But there really is, I think, an infrastructural gap that sort of bridges these two worlds, really. And that's one of the things that I hope sort of we see start to come out of these reports, because as Gauri said, the first step is to understand what does the legislation say, but then the next step is how do we create those linkages. And I think that there's really an opportunity there for somebody who understands the policy world and is active in that space to maybe work to sort of set up that bridge. there's a question from Susan on the 2 sessions for 2 time zones. The next webinar is only happening at 10 a.m. CET. That's because we expect most people who are in attendance to be suppliers, but they will be recorded. So if you're not in a time zone that would, if it's not a convenient time for you, register anyway, and you'll get a recording. There was also a question from Julia about whether or not, if you have questions in the future, can you raise them? Yes, please do. You can always email me. I'm kim@transformersfoundation.org, and then we'll disseminate your question appropriately to the right person. And on our website, we also have a general communications email, which you can check. And the other way that you could reach us is that middle QR code, support future fact sheets. In that form, there's a field where you can leave a question. So lots of ways to get in touch with us. All right. Then the next question is from Lisa. When do you suggest for suppliers to engage their customers, now or after the directive has been translated into national law? Do any of the panelists particularly want to take this question? Yeah,
I'm happy
Yes,
to
please.
answer that.
Kavita,
I would
go first.
say that take advantage of these fact sheets and understand as best as you can, because these are complicated legislations, and start engaging with your customers and your supply chain as soon as you can. And obviously there will be certain topics that will be easier to broach, and there will be others which will be more controversial and difficult. But I think that awareness, when it comes to, say, your contractual obligations with your customers, awareness of where you have support from legislations like CSDDD, where they are stressing on better purchasing practices and possibly disclosure by brands as well. All of that will help you have these conversations. So I would say sooner is better than later.
Thank you. And Kyle.
Yes, actually, we have already started some discussion with our key customers. I think now is already a very good time to start discussion with your key customers, because taking like ESBL as an example, we all know that it's going to have a more specific rule, but all the brand customers and ourselves, we understand that we have to prepare for it. So prior to having a detailed planning or approach to accommodate to the new regulation, I think it is always good to start an early discussion and alignment with your customers, so that we can understand the challenges of each other, and then to plan an aligned approach and a collective approach together. And then, yeah, with all the things considered, I think it would be a better outcomes once the details are coming out. So this is what we are taking.
Thank you, Kyle. Does anybody else want to add anything to that question? No? Okay. Well, I think we have covered all of the questions in the Q&A. So I would invite, I don't know if any of the panelists have any final or last thoughts, things you'd like to say that you haven't had a chance to say, then there's no pressure to do so. But if you do, this is your chance. Okay, well then I know it's really late for many of you, really, really late. So I would just thank you for spending your evening, panelists, with us. And it's remarkable, I think, how coherent you are given the late hour. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us and taking a piece of your day, taking out a piece of your day to be here with us. And hopefully we look forward to seeing you in September for the next webinar, the deep dive. So with that, I am going to, one last late hour question. For the benefit of suppliers, can there be common questions for all brands? Oh, that's interesting. You mean like a conversation guide for like, these are the questions you should ask your brands. Anyone? Corey, I see you nodding. Do you want to respond to that one?
No, it's a good idea. We can think about that. It's like, what should you, based on the legislations, what should you ask all your customers? But maybe Kyle can also add. I feel like, yeah, it would still have to be separate conversations because each brand operates differently, but there could be a common set of questions that come up, I guess, and it may be common across suppliers also.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. Kyle?
Yes, certainly. From what I have observed so far, because different brands and different customers, they are still planning in the detailed approach. So I think to do it in a collective way perhaps would be a more effective one to take. So yeah, I strongly agree that this is a good approach that we should think about it.
Thanks, Kyle. And I guess, like, from my side, what I would just say too is that I think there's a need for suppliers to also think creatively about how we might work together on these issues. And this is a great example of it because, in general, you know, a lot of actors and companies in the supply chain don't have huge sustainability departments, don't have a ton of resources. So how can we sort of work to share this burden together, whether it's resources like the one we've just created, whether it's some kind of a discussion guide for having these conversations with your brand, or maybe even legal advice, you know, or strategists. So that would be, I suppose, my final call to action for this. And with that, for real this time, I will close the session. Thank you for being here and have a good evening, afternoon, day, wherever you are.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.